Hello, my name is Amina, and I will be going through my term project for CIS 285 at University of Michigan Dearborn, and we'll be taking a look at a system called SplitSmart. So the system itself has been designed to help groups of users manage their shared expenses in a clean and organized fashion. I'll be taking a look at the system's features, the actors, and the UML diagrams involved that model how the system itself works. So, SplitSmart is a system that has been built to help groups track their shared expenses and payments. The system supports several types of users, including regular users, approvers, and group owners. The users can create expenses and submit them for approval. They're also able to generate financial summaries, and approvers can review and approve or reject these expenses. And the users can also receive notifications about the approvals, rejections, and payments. In one line, the goal of SplitSmart is to make group expense management simple and accurate. So this would be highly useful for people that prefer tracking their expenses online and just want to have everything in one page. Okay, so we're going to take a look at the actors. We have four main actors in SplitSmart. First of all, we have the user, and as written, creates expenses, records payments, and views summaries. Then we have the approver, and as written, they review and approve or reject expenses. We also have the group owner, which just creates and manages the group. So that's a simple role. And then we have the system. The system itself acts as a participant, but it performs the calculations, it processes the rules, the validations, and approvals or rejections, and it handles all the logic that we don't see. So the system kind of just makes sure that everything is working properly and correctly. Now we're going to move on to the use case diagram. The diagram itself will display all interactions between the actors and the system. Now we can take a look. Here is the diagram itself. The user, approver, and the group owner all have their own different actions, although some of them do belong to two different actors at once. The use case diagram itself just allows us to visualize those interactions clearly. Without the use case diagram, things would be a little more difficult to understand, and this just allows us to comprehend the logic behind the application itself and where each command is going. So for example, we can see that the user is able to view personal balance summaries, they're able to log in, log out, and view group details, whereas the approver can reject expenses and approve expenses. Meanwhile, the group owner is also given the liberty to do so. So this is quite interesting, and just having the diagram in front of us really allows us to understand the role of every actor and how much involvement they have. Moving forward, class diagram. This is a system made using key classes. So for example, as written on the slideshow, we've got the user, expenses, payment, notification, and report generator. So I'll move on to the diagram. The diagram itself shows how the classes can relate to each other. So for example, we can see how users belong to groups and how expenses connect to payments and how the notifications are automatically generated. So it provides the structural foundation visually for the entire system. This, again, similar to the use case diagram, just makes it a lot easier to understand how involved each of the classes are with one another. And it's quite interesting actually how notifications are automatically generated. You can notice the connection between expenses and notifications, which is something you may not see in other classes. All right, moving forward, we can take a look at the activity diagram. So the activity diagram itself shows the workflow, and um, it starts from creating an expense. It validates the expense and sends it for approval. And also, the activity diagram itself shows how balances are updated after being approved or rejected. So, um, just in more depth, we'll start with the user entering their expense details. Then the system validates the information, and once that is cleared and it looks good, the expense is submitted for approval. The approver, which is the actor we saw before, reviews the expense and either approves the expense or rejects it. If the expense is approved, the system updates the group's balances, and the diagram itself helps to break the workflow of the system into clear steps from the start to the end. So here is the activity diagram. It's pretty simple. It's been broken down into simple steps, so you can see how the user is the one creating the expenses. They're the ones entering the details, so the amount, any description, and those involved, meaning participants. And you can see how the user submits the expense for approval, so that is the job of the user. Then moving on to the approver, you can see they're waiting for pending expenses. So they're waiting for any expense so that they can view it. Then once they have that, they review the details. And now we have a decision tree over here. So it is up to them to either approve the expense or reject the expense. Now we look at the system again, more logical. They validate the expense data, then they set the expense status to pending, which is a good update to have if people are interested in what's actually going on behind the scenes. Then the system sends a notification to the approver. And now we once more have a decision tree, and you can see how they are given either on one side the ability to have the expense approved or rejected. So if approved, you can see the system sets status to approved. It updates the balances and notifies group members. Meanwhile, on the right-hand side, if the expense were to be rejected, the status is set to rejected, and the creator will be notified. So no balance would be updated as there is no new expense. All right, now we have the activity diagram. So, as the slide reads, the activity diagram describes how a user can input payment details and how the system handles validating, recording, and applying payments to balances. So, just to expand on that, the diagram shows what happens when a user records a payment. We can see how the user would enter the payment details and how the system validates the information and how the payment is officially recorded. Once that is done, the system adjusts the balances based on who has paid which other user. This is a simple process, but just having a diagram out really shows you how logical it is and how consistent the logic actually is. And it ensures that the application foundation has been set so that the expenses involved and the payments that are being recorded are actually accurate and there is no error within the software itself. So if we take a look at that, this is the diagram similar to the ones before. It's just you start off with the user and they choose to record a payment. After that, they're able to enter the payment details. So the payer, meaning who's paying, the payee, so who's getting the money, the amount of money, the date, so when this transaction is being held, and any note. Then they have the option of submitting the payment, which is obviously essential in order to really confirm that you are recording a payment. From there, the data heads to the system, and the first step is to validate the payment data. This is just to make sure that everything is accurate and that they can actually go ahead with the details they've been given. Sometimes if it's incorrect, it's not going to go through, so this is an essential step. Next, the system creates the payment record. So this just gives it a space to preserve all this information. Then we apply the payment, the system applies the payment to the balance. And lastly, the system sends the notifications to both the user who is paying and the user that is being paid. This is something that we see in our regular life and is quite essential because you don't want to just send money and not get any confirmation. That is sometimes pretty alarming and you're not sure if the money went through, and this can cause a lot of panic. Whereas if you're being the one receiving the money and you're not in the same room as the person sending you the money, you always want to make sure that you get some sort of confirmation to ensure that your money is actually being delivered to you and it has not just been accidentally given to someone else or didn't go through due to any internet concerns. Now we can move forward with the bottom of this diagram. So as you can see here, that was actually the last step. That's great. So I always like to put a button to confirm that that was the final step so we can move forward. Now we can take a look at the activity diagram for generating a report. So as the slide reads, this shows the steps for filtering the data, retrieving the matching expenses and payments. Hold up 1 second. I apologize. All right. So shows the steps for filtering the data, retrieving the matching expenses and payments, collecting the totals, and formatting the final report. So just to expand on that, for this activity diagram, the user would have their data filtered according to the date range, the group, or the expense type. From there, the system retrieves the matching expenses and payments. It calculates the totals and formats the report. Finally, the report would be shown to the user, so that would be the last step. This would just highlight how the financial summaries are made. So it would take a look at the process that leads to it. So here we just have the user and the system in our swim lanes. And you can see how it starts with the user selecting generate a report. So all of these diagrams start with the user picking a command. So in this case, it would be generating a report. And from there, they're able to filter the criteria they're looking for. So whether they want to take a look at it by group, by date, or by type of expense. They submit a request for that, and that gets transferred to the system. Now here, the system would validate the filter criteria, so it would understand that there's a filter being placed by the user and it needs to look for answers according to that. So for example, if the user selects to filter by date range, so if they want to look at expenses for a certain month, now the system would acknowledge that and start looking for expenses and payments during that month only. Now from there, they will calculate the totals involved in the financial summaries. So for example, if the user were to request a report for the month of December, the system would calculate the totals and financial summaries for the month of December. Now they'll format a report, so they'll build a report using the data they have, and they'll share that with the user. And that would be the final step. Now we have the sequence diagram. We'll be taking a look at the diagram involving creating and approving expenses. The participants involved in this diagram would be the user, expense UI, system, expense, notification service, and group. You can see how it's got boundary, control, and entity written on a few of these items. This is done purposefully and is essential for our UML diagrams. So the diagram itself covers entering the expense details, submitting for approval. It involves the approver reviewing and approving or rejecting the expenses. It involves updating balances and sending notifications. So this kind of just captures the flow of the application and provides a deep look into how all these components work together in order. So this is the diagram itself, and you can see how each object is almost dependent on the other. You can see how the user relies on the system to create an expense and also trusts the expense UI to display that information. You can see how the system then validates the data through the expense object. So it is quite a complicated system and diagram itself. And on the next slide, you can see that there's actually much more to it. And finally, you can also see in the box how you've got one side that shows what is done when the expense is rejected versus if you go behind, you can see how the side is being handled when the expense has been approved. So it's a complicated diagram, as I mentioned before, and it is critical to have so that the application runs logically and smooth. Next, we have the sequence diagram, and for this second sequence diagram, it involves generating the report. So as the slide reads, the user selects report filters, the system validates it, and retrieves expenses and payments. It calculates the totals, it formats the report, and displays the report. So if I were to expand on that, I'd just say that the diagram itself helps to visualize the order of operations behind the report generation. This means that we're able to see the steps that lead to the report being generated. So here is the report process. You can see how the user selects the payment details and submits it to the system, and how involved the system is with all of these activities. Although the system is given more of a logical road and not really looked at, um, you can see how the payment UI submits the payment to the system and how the system notifies the payer and payee through the report generator. Now we have the state machine diagram. This one is labeled expense lifecycle. So the expense first starts in a draft state, and once the user submits it, it changes into the state of pending approval. So it's waiting for an answer. So from there, the approver either approves or rejects it, which is why we have both approved and rejected written as our states. Then we also have the settled state, which happens once approved expenses are brought over, and rejected expenses eventually move to the final or archive state. The diagram will show how the expenses transitions throughout its whole cycle, its life cycle actually in the system. So we'll see the processes the expenses go through when it comes to just the application itself. So this is a more simple diagram. You can see how it starts with creating the expense and it's still in the draft zone. Then it makes its way to pending approval. And from there, if it's approved, it goes straight to being settled and then archived. Whereas if it were to be rejected, it goes from rejected to its final form, which would be right there. So, in conclusion, Split Smart provides a structured, easy, logical way for groups to manage their shared expenses. It creates it displays clear workflows that show how the expenses and payments are managed. It uses accurate calculations for the balances through the system. It also has approval mechanisms and notifications so that users are aware of what is going on with their expenses. And it involves a full UML model that demonstrates the system structure and behavior. This is my term project, and thank you for listening.